At a slave auction in Richmond, Virginia, on March 3, 1839, a woman named Clara stood on the auction block carrying a secret that would destroy two wealthy families. She was visibly pregnant, 7 months along. In the brutal economics of slavery, pregnant women were typically valued higher. A child meant future labor, future profit. Buyers would bid competitively for a woman who came with a bonus worker already in development. But when the bidding started for Clara, something strange happened. The price went down, and down, and down to R400, then to the 100, then 50E. Finally, a small-time tobacco farmer named Thomas Webb bid 12 cents. 12 cents for a healthy 24-year-old woman, 7 months pregnant, with documented skills as a seamstress and house servant. The auctioneer, confused but obligated, accepted the bid. Clara was sold for the price of a newspaper, less than a loaf of bread. The lowest recorded price for a human being at that auction house in its 40-year history. Why? Because everyone at that auction knew whose child Clara was carrying. And no one, absolutely no one, wanted to be caught holding that particular piece of evidence when the scandal broke. Clara was pregnant with her previous master's child. But not just any master. She was pregnant with the child of Judge William Harrison, one of the wealthiest and most politically powerful men in Virginia. A man who sat on the state Supreme Court. A man whose family had been in Virginia aristocracy for 3 generations. A man who was currently running for governor, and Clara had been sold at auction not to hide the pregnancy, but to expose it. This was calculated revenge orchestrated by Judge Harrison's own wife, designed to destroy her husband's career, his reputation, and his legacy. This is the story of how one enslaved woman became a weapon in a war between the Virginia elite, and how the child she carried would become living proof of the lies that propped up the entire Southern aristocracy. Judge William Harrison's plantation, Riverside Estate, sat on 400 acres along the James River, about 15 miles outside Richmond. It was a monument to Virginia old money. The main house had been built in 1782 by Harrison's grandfather, a tobacco magnate who'd made a fortune supplying European markets. By 1838, William Harrison owned 87 enslaved people, making him one of the largest slaveholders in the county. He'd inherited the property at age 28 when his father died in 1820, and had spent the next 18 years expanding his wealth and political influence. Harrison had married Margaret Cavendish in 1821, a strategic alliance between two powerful Virginia families. Margaret brought a dowry of 15,000 and connections to Richmond's political elite. They had 4 children: William Jr., Robert, Catherine, and Elizabeth. The family attended Episcopal services every Sunday, hosted elaborate parties for Virginia's political class, and maintained a reputation as a model of Southern Christian values. Judge Harrison had been appointed to the Virginia Supreme Court in 1835. By 1838, he was being seriously discussed as a candidate for governor. Newspapers described him as a man of unimpeachable character and refinement. His political allies praised his devotion to family, faith, and the Commonwealth. But inside Riverside Estate, Judge Harrison was committing the most common and most invisible crime in the antebellum South: the systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved women. Clara had been born on the Harrison plantation in 1815. She'd grown up in the slave quarters, learning to sew from her mother, working as a house servant from age 12. She was intelligent, skilled, and by all accounts, tried to make herself as invisible as possible, a survival strategy for enslaved women on plantations where the master had a reputation. Because Judge Harrison did have a reputation, the enslaved community at Riverside knew. They whispered about it in the quarters after dark. About the women who were summoned to the main house at night. About the children born with suspiciously light skin who were quickly sold away to distant plantations before they got old enough for the resemblance to become obvious. Margaret Harrison knew too. She'd known for years. She saw the women her husband selected, always young, always attractive, always powerless to refuse. She saw the children who looked like her own sons. She heard the whispers, saw the knowing looks from other plantation wives who were too polite to mention it directly. For 17 years, Margaret had said nothing. Because what could she say? Enslaved women had no legal protection against sexual assault. Masters had absolute power over the people they owned. And if Margaret confronted her husband publicly, she would only humiliate herself while accomplishing nothing. So she remained silent. She managed the household, raised her children, attended church, and pretended not to see what was happening 20 feet from her bedroom. Until Clara. Clara had been working as a seamstress in the plantation house since age 16. She was quiet, efficient, unremarkable, exactly the kind of enslaved person who could move through a house without attracting attention. But in the spring of 1838, Judge Harrison began summoning her to his private study in the evenings when Margaret was visiting her sister in Charlottesville. Clara had no choice. Refusal meant punishment, whipping, being sold to a harsher plantation, possibly being separated from her mother, who was elderly and still lived in the slave quarters. So Clara went to the study when summoned. She endured what she had to endure, and she said nothing, but by August 1838 Clara was pregnant at Margaret Harrison's discovery and calculation 583 of Margaret Harrison discovered Clara's pregnancy in October 1838. She'd noticed Clara's morning sickness, the slight changes in her figure. Margaret had borne 4 children herself. She knew the signs. Initially, Margaret assumed this was just another one of her husband's indiscretions. Another enslaved woman pregnant with his child, who would give birth, and then the child would be sold away quietly, and life would continue as it always had. But then Margaret learned something that changed everything. One of the house servants, a woman named Dina who'd been at Riverside for 30 years and had watched Margaret grow from a new bride into a bitter, silent wife, came to Margaret privately. Dinah was taking an enormous risk. Enslaved people who got involved in white family conflicts could be punished severely. But Dinah had watched Clara's quiet suffering and felt compelled to speak. Dinah told Margaret that Judge Harrison hadn't just assaulted Clara once or twice. He'd been summoning Clara to his study for months, dozens of times over the spring and summer of 1838. He'd told Clara that if she got pregnant, he would free her child, that the child would be raised in the house, educated, given opportunities, that this was an honor, a privilege. All lies, Dinah explained. Every enslaved woman at Riverside knew the pattern. The promises, the pregnancies, and then the sudden sales to distant plantations once the children were born and the resemblance became too obvious to ignore. But this time, there was something different. Clara's pregnancy had occurred at a very specific time, between May and July 1838, and in May 1838, Judge Harrison had been photographed for the first time in his life. Photography was brand new technology in 1838. A daguerreotype photographer had come to Richmond offering sittings to wealthy families. Judge Harrison, preparing for his gubernatorial campaign, had sat for a formal portrait. The image showed him in his judicial robes, looking dignified and authoritative. That photograph was being reproduced and distributed throughout Virginia as part of Harrison's political campaign. Newspapers were running the image alongside articles about his candidacy. It was being displayed in shop windows, distributed as campaign materials, hung in government offices. And when Clara's child was born, that child would look exactly like the photograph every voter in Virginia was staring at. Margaret Harrison realized she was holding a weapon more powerful than any she'd ever possessed. Not just evidence of her husband's infidelity, that was common enough among plantation owners and rarely caused serious scandal. No, this was different. This was a child who would be born at a time when her husband was running for governor on a platform of family values, Christian morality, and the natural order of racial hierarchy. A child whose existence would prove that the man lecturing Virginia about moral superiority was himself violating the very boundaries he claimed were sacred. Margaret made a decision that would shock Virginia society. She would not hide this pregnancy. She would weaponize it. Margaret Harrison's plan was brilliant in its cruelty, not toward Clara, but toward her husband. Typically, when enslaved women on the Harrison plantation became pregnant by the master, they were quietly sold to distant plantations. Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, places far enough away that the children would never be seen by Virginia society. The sales were arranged discreetly through private brokers, not public auctions. But Margaret insisted that Clara be sold at the Richmond Public Auction House, the largest, most visible slave market in Virginia. She insisted the sale happen in March 1839, when Clara would be 7 months pregnant and the pregnancy impossible to hide. Judge Harrison resisted initially. He understood the implications. A public auction would draw attention. Questions would be asked. But Margaret had leverage. She threatened to leave him, to take their children and return to her family in Charlottesville, to write letters to every political ally her husband had, explaining why she was leaving. In 1839 Virginia, a wife leaving her husband was a catastrophic scandal. It would destroy Harrison's gubernatorial campaign instantly. Political opponents would seize on it as evidence of moral unfitness. Margaret's family had significant political connections. Her father had served in the state legislature, and her public departure would carry weight. So Judge Harrison agreed to the public auction. He convinced himself that the pregnancy wouldn't be traced back to him. After all, Enslaved women had no legal standing to accuse white men of anything. No one would officially acknowledge the obvious. But Margaret wasn't done. She had one more strategic move. She made sure everyone knew. In the weeks before the auction, Margaret hosted a tea party for the wives of Richmond's political elite. 20 women gathered in the Harrison parlor, drinking imported tea and eating elaborate cakes. And Margaret, in a voice dripping with controlled fury, mentioned, almost casually, that they would be selling one of our girls at the upcoming Richmond auction. She's with child, Margaret said, stirring her tea. Due in May. We don't know the father, of course, though I have my suspicions. Then she looked directly at the wife of her husband's closest political ally and added, I do hope the child doesn't resemble anyone we know. That would be so unfortunate. The message was clear, and within days, every woman in Richmond society knew. Judge William Harrison's enslaved seamstress was being sold publicly while pregnant with a child that would likely prove his paternity. The political implications were immediate. Whispers began circulating. Political opponents started making veiled references to family values and moral character in their campaign speeches. Newspapers began running stories about the importance of consistency between public positions and private behavior, and the slave auction drew an enormous crowd. March 3, 1839. The Richmond slave auction house was packed. Typically, Sunday auctions drew 50-75 buyers. This Sunday there were over 200 people present, and most of them weren't there to buy. They were there to witness. Virginia's political class had turned out. Plantation owners who knew Judge Harrison, merchants who did business with him, rival politicians who smelled blood in the water. Even some of Harrison's allies were there, if only to assess the damage and calculate whether their association with him was now a liability. Clara was brought to the auction block at approximately 2:00 p.m. She was wearing a simple dress that couldn't conceal her 7-month pregnancy. She walked slowly, heavily, with the careful gait of a woman in her 3rd trimester. The auctioneer, a man named Silas Crawford who'd been running Richmond auctions for 15 years, looked distinctly uncomfortable. He knew exactly what he was selling and why. He'd been approached by multiple people in the preceding days, some offering him money to cancel the sale, others offering him money to make sure it proceeded. Crawford called for opening bids. Typically, a healthy 24-year-old woman with domestic skills would start bidding at $801,000. Pregnant women often commanded premium prices because the unborn child represented future value. But this wasn't a typical auction. The first bid was $800,000, from a plantation owner from Norfolk who apparently hadn't gotten the message about why this particular sale was occurring. But he was quickly pulled aside by someone who whispered in his ear. The Norfolk man turned pale and withdrew his bid. Then the bidding went in reverse. Someone bid $400, apparently testing whether this was legitimate. Another bid $200, then $100, then $50. The crowd was silent, watching. This wasn't about buying an enslaved person. This was about making a statement. Every person who refused to bid was declaring that they wanted nothing to do with Judge William Harrison's scandal. Finally, a tobacco farmer named Thomas Webb, a small-time operator with maybe 200 acres and 6 enslaved workers, bid 12 cents. He later told people he did it because he felt sorry for the girl, and 12 cents was what I had in my pocket. Crawford, the auctioneer, looked around the crowd. 200 people, many of them wealthy plantation owners who regularly spent thousands on enslaved people, and none of them would bid more than 12 cents. Crawford had to ask 3 times if there were other bids. Auction house rules required it. The silence was deafening. Sold, Crawford finally said, to Thomas Webb for 12 cents. Clara was led off the auction block. The crowd began to disperse, and Judge William Harrison's gubernatorial campaign was effectively over. The Richmond newspapers didn't directly report on the auction. Reporting on individual slave sales wasn't standard practice, but they didn't need to. The story spread through Virginia society like wildfire. Have you heard about the 12-cent auction? Became a common question in Richmond parlors and political meetings. Everyone knew what it meant. Everyone understood the unspoken accusation. Judge Harrison's political opponents began making increasingly pointed references. A newspaper editorial published 5 days after the auction discussed the importance of consistency between the moral standards we preach and the moral standards we practice. Another article, ostensibly about agricultural prices, mentioned that some items at auction have been known to sell for extraordinarily low prices, as low as 12 cents. When buyers wished to send a message about quality, Harrison's allies began distancing themselves. Campaign events were quietly canceled. Political endorsements were withdrawn. The Richmond political establishment had decided William Harrison was toxic. Harrison himself initially tried to weather the storm. He gave speeches about his devotion to family and commonwealth. He attended church visibly, sitting in the front pew with Margaret and their children. He continued his judicial duties as if nothing had changed. But the whispers wouldn't stop. And then in May 1839, Clara gave birth. The child was a boy. Thomas Webb, the tobacco farmer who'd purchased Clara, named him Samuel. And Samuel looked exactly like William Harrison Jr., Judge Harrison's oldest son. Same facial structure, same eye color, same distinctive Harrison family chin that appeared in every generation. Webb, who'd purchased Clara partly out of sympathy, and partly because 12 cents was genuinely all he had in his pocket at the moment, found himself holding extremely dangerous property. He had an enslaved child who was visible proof of a sitting Supreme Court justice's sexual exploitation of enslaved women. Webb was visited by multiple representatives of the Harrison family over the following months. They offered to purchase Clara and Samuel for increasingly large sums, $2,000, then $5,000, then $8,000. Desperate to make the evidence disappear, Webb, to his credit, refused. Not out of moral principle. He was a slaveholder himself, after all. But because he'd figured out that he now had leverage. He told Harrison's representatives that he'd consider selling, but only if Judge Harrison publicly withdrew from political life entirely. It was extortion, plain and simple, but it worked. In August 1839, Judge William Harrison announced he was withdrawing from the gubernatorial race due to health concerns, and would be spending more time with family. Within a year, he'd resigned from the Virginia Supreme Court. He retreated to Riverside Estate and essentially disappeared from public life. Margaret Harrison stayed. She didn't leave her husband as she'd threatened. She'd already accomplished what she wanted. She'd destroyed his political career, humiliated him in front of Virginia society, and ensured he'd never have public power again. She remained at Riverside, managing the household, raising her children, and presumably enjoying her victory. Clara lived on Thomas Webb's small tobacco farm for the next 26 years. Webb owned 6 enslaved people total, a much smaller operation than Riverside Estate. The work was hard, tobacco farming was brutal, but Clara was at least away from Judge Harrison. Samuel grew up on Webb's farm, working in the tobacco fields from age 5. He was noticeably light-skinned, and as he got older, the resemblance to Judge William Harrison became even more pronounced. People who visited Webb's farm would stare at Samuel, then exchange knowing looks. Webb never sold Clara or Samuel, despite continuing offers from Harrison representatives. Part of this was the leverage he'd gained. Keeping them gave him insurance against potential Harrison retaliation. Part was apparently that Webb's wife, Martha, had grown fond of Clara and insisted they not be sold. During the Civil War, Webb's farm struggled like most small Virginia operations. He couldn't grow tobacco profitably with Union blockades destroying export markets. By 1863, Webb had sold or lost most of his enslaved people, except Clara and Samuel, whom he kept. When the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in Union-controlled areas of Virginia in 1863, Clara and Samuel were technically freed, though Webb's farm was in contested territory and the enforcement of freedom was inconsistent. By 1865, when the war ended, Clara was 50 years old and Samuel was 26. They stayed on Webb's farm as paid workers, a common arrangement when formerly enslaved people had nowhere else to go and farm owners needed labor. Clara worked as a seamstress. Samuel worked in the tobacco fields. They were paid minimal wages, barely enough to survive, but they were legally free. Clara lived until 1871, dying at age 56 from pneumonia. She was buried in a small cemetery on Webb's property. Her grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, later replaced by a stone marker that read, Clara, born 1815, died 1870, lived longer. He married a woman named Ruth in 1867, had 3 children, and continued working as a farm laborer in Virginia until his death in 1903 at age 64. And he never publicly acknowledged who his father was. He never sought out the Harrison family, never claimed any inheritance, never told his children the full story. He carried the secret his entire life, visible in his face, known by everyone who saw him, but never spoken aloud. Judge William Harrison lived until 1867, dying at age 75. He spent his final 28 years in near total seclusion at Riverside Estate. He never returned to politics. He never practiced law again. He never attended social functions. He sold off large portions of the plantation to pay debts. By 1865, Riverside Estate was down to 600 acres and fewer than 20 enslaved people. The Civil War destroyed what remained of the Harrison fortune. Confederate currency became worthless. The plantation economy collapsed. When Harrison died in 1867, His obituary in the Richmond newspaper was brief, 3 sentences noting his previous judicial service and his death. No mention of his gubernatorial campaign, no praise for his character or achievements. He'd been functionally erased from Virginia political history. Margaret Harrison outlived her husband by 12 years. She died in 1879 at age 80. She spent her widowhood maintaining Riverside Estate, managing what remained of the family property, and apparently never speaking publicly about the scandal that had defined the family's trajectory. Of their 4 children, William Harrison Jr. served in the Confederate Army, was wounded at Gettysburg and returned to Virginia where he worked as a clerk. He never married, never achieved political prominence, and died in 1891. Robert Harrison left Virginia entirely, moving to St. Louis in 1845 to escape the family scandal. He worked as a merchant and lived under the name Robert Cavendish, say his mother's maiden name to avoid association. He died in 1888. Catherine Harrison married a minor planter from North Carolina in 1844 and moved away. She maintained minimal contact with her parents and apparently spent her life trying to distance herself from the scandal. Elizabeth Harrison never married. She lived at Riverside Estate with her mother until Margaret's death, then moved to Richmond where she lived with her sister Catherine's family until her own death in 1901. The Harrison family, once one of Virginia's most prominent political dynasties, faded into obscurity within a single generation. The 12-cent auction destroyed not just Judge Harrison's career, but his family's legacy. The story of Clara's 12-cent auction was known in Virginia oral history for decades, passed down through both white and black families as a cautionary tale or a piece of scandalous gossip. But it wasn't academically verified until 1967. A graduate student named Patricia Morrison was researching slave auction records at the Virginia Historical Society for her dissertation on slave market economics. She was analyzing pricing patterns, trying to understand what factors influenced the sale prices of enslaved people. When she found the March 3, 1839 Richmond auction records, she initially thought there was a clerical error. The entry read a female age 24 seamstress house servant, pregnant 7 months, sold to Thomas Webb for 0.11 to 12 cents. Morrison assumed this was a typo. Someone had written 12 instead of first 200 or had abbreviated 12 as WAR 12. But when she cross-referenced with other documentation, newspaper accounts, private letters, tax records, she confirmed it was accurate. Morrison then found correspondence between Thomas Webb and Harrison family representatives, offering increasingly large sums to purchase Clara and her child. She found Margaret Harrison's personal diaries donated to the Historical Society by Elizabeth Harrison's descendants, which contained veiled but clear references to the seamstress situation and Margaret's deliberate decision to make the sale public. She found census records showing Samuel living on Webb's farm, and later, living independently as Samuel Webb, with a family. She found Judge Harrison's abrupt withdrawal from political life and his obituary's conspicuous lack of praise. All the pieces fit. The auction wasn't a pricing error or an economic anomaly. It was a coordinated political statement, a crowd of Virginia's elite refusing to bid, sending a message that William Harrison was untouchable. Morrison published her findings in 1969 in an academic journal article titled The Political Economy of Scandal, Sexual Exploitation and Slave Market Prices in Antebellum Virginia. The article received attention in academic circles but not beyond. It was too specialized, published in an obscure journal. But in the 1980s and 1990s, as historians began paying more attention to enslaved women's experiences and the sexual exploitation endemic to slavery, Clara's story was rediscovered. It appeared in several books about women and slavery, political scandals in the antebellum South, and the complexities of slave market economics. And gradually, Clara's 12-cent auction became recognized as one of the most extraordinary documented cases of how sexual exploitation, political power, and economic systems intersected in the slavery era. 12 cents. The price of a newspaper, less than a loaf of bread, the lowest recorded price for a human being at Richmond's largest slave auction in 40 years. But those 12 cents meant something far more significant than market failure or pricing error. They represented a coordinated act of political punishment. 200 of Virginia's elite standing in an auction house and refusing to bid, refusing to provide Judge William Harrison with the cover of a normal sale, refusing to let him hide his crime. It was not justice. Let's be clear about that. Clara was still sold. She was still enslaved for another 26 years. Her child Samuel was still born into bondage and remained enslaved until the Civil War freed him. The system that allowed Harrison to sexually exploit Clara with impunity remained intact, but it was accountability of a sort. the only kind possible in a system built on absolute white male power over enslaved people. Harrison couldn't be legally charged with rape. Enslaved women had no legal protection. He couldn't be formally impeached. His conduct, while scandalous, wasn't technically illegal, but he could be destroyed socially and politically. And that's exactly what Margaret Harrison engineered. She used the tools available to her, public shame, social ostracism, political pressure, to exact revenge on her husband and end his career. Clara became a weapon in that war, not by her choice but by circumstance. Her pregnancy, her body, her child, all became evidence in a conflict between white elites. She had no power in the situation, but her existence disrupted everything Harrison had built. The 12-cent price tag was a statement: "We see what you've done, we know whose child this is, and we want nothing to do with it, or you." It's a complex story with no clear heroes. Margaret Harrison destroyed her husband's career, yes, but she kept him as her husband, continued living on a plantation powered by enslaved labor, and benefited from that system until her death. Thomas Webb purchased Clara for 12 cents partly from sympathy, but he enslaved her for another 26 years and worked her son in his tobacco fields from age 5. And Clara herself, forced into sexual exploitation by one powerful man, sold as punishment by another powerful man's wife, purchased by a third man who used her labor for decades, survived. She raised her son. She lived to see emancipation. She was buried in a grave marked with her name. Samuel carried his father's face for his entire life, visible evidence of slavery's most common invisible crime. He never claimed the Harrison name, never sought inheritance, never publicly demanded recognition. He lived as Samuel Webb, married, raised children, worked until his death in 1903. Their descendants live today, hundreds of people carrying genetic material from both Judge William Harrison and Clara, connected by a crime that happened in 1838 and an auction that happened in 1839 and a system that made it all legal. The story of the 12-cent auction forces us to confront the intersection of sexual violence, political power, economic exploitation, and social control that defined slavery. It shows how enslaved women's bodies became battlegrounds for conflicts between white elites. It demonstrates how accountability, even when it existed, was never about justice for the victims, but about power dynamics within the ruling class. Clara was sold for 12 cents not because she was worthless, but because she was too valuable. As evidence, her pregnancy proved what everyone knew but no one could officially acknowledge: that the moral boundaries Southern aristocracy claimed were sacred were violated constantly by the very men enforcing them. 12 cents bought a woman and the child she carried, but it cost Judge William Harrison everything: his career, his reputation, his family's legacy, and his place in history. Sometimes the price of a human being tells you nothing about the person being sold, and everything about the people refusing to buy.